Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. Whispering Woods. The sun was dipping below the horizon as a group of 6 friends arrived at the edge of Whispering Woods, a dense forest known for its eerie beauty and local legends. Olivia, the de facto leader, was the first to step into the clearing they had chosen as their campsite. "This is perfect," she said, setting down her backpack. Far enough from the main trail, but close enough to the stream. The group consisted of Olivia, her boyfriend Ethan, their childhood friend Liam, the adventurous Mia, the skeptical Ava, and Marcus, who had a knack for turning any situation into a joke. They worked together to pitch their tents, gather firewood, and prepare for what they thought would be a relaxing weekend of hiking and stargazing. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of chirping crickets and rustling leaves. The group gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. Marcus entertained them with a dramatic retelling of a ghost story he had heard in town. "They say the Whispering Woods got its name because the trees talk to each other," he said, his face lit by the flickering firelight. "But some people claim the whispers are the voices of those who disappeared here, trying to warn others." "Sounds like nonsense to me," Ava scoffed. "Trees don't talk, and neither do ghosts." "Maybe not," Marcus replied with a grin. "But the woods do have a way of making you feel like you're not alone." They laughed off the story, but as the night deepened, an unsettling quiet settled over the forest. The usual nighttime sounds seemed to fade, leaving an oppressive silence. Ethan was the first to notice. "It's too quiet," he said, glancing around nervously. "Where did the crickets go? Maybe they don't like our singing," Mia joked, but her voice wavered. Then they heard it, a faint whisper carried on the wind. It was so soft that at first they thought they had imagined it. But as the whispers grew louder, the group fell silent, straining to hear. "Well, what is that?" Olivia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The sound seemed to come from all around them, weaving through the trees and swirling around the campfire. It was indistinct at first, like the rustle of leaves, but soon they could make out words, their words. "Did you hear that?" The whispers repeated, mimicking Ethan's earlier comment. Then came Mia's joke. "Maybe they don't like our singing." The group exchanged uneasy glances. "This isn't funny," Ava said, her skepticism giving way to fear. The whispers continued, growing clearer and more unsettling. They weren't just repeating what had been said around the campfire. They were revealing things no one else should know. "Why do you always lie to Ethan?" the whispers asked, directed at Olivia. She froze, her face turning pale. "Well, what is it talking about?" Ethan demanded, looking at her. "I don't know," Olivia stammered, but the guilt in her eyes told a different story. The voices turned to Liam. "Why did you steal from Marcus? Do you think he doesn't know?" "What?" Marcus exclaimed, turning to Liam. "You stole from me?" "It's not true," Liam protested, but his flushed face betrayed him. The whispers moved from one person to the next, airing their secrets and fears. Mia's adventurous facade cracked as the whispers revealed her crippling fear of failure. Ava's skepticism was stripped away as the voices taunted her about her deeply buried belief in the supernatural. Marcus, usually the joker, was accused of spreading lies about the others behind their backs. Panic set in. "This can't be real," Ava said, her voice shaking. "It's some kind of prank. How could it know all that?" Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. Ethan stood abruptly. "We're leaving. Now. Pack up your stuff." But as they scrambled to gather their belongings, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The wind picked up, whipping through the clearing and extinguishing the campfire. In the darkness, the whispers became deafening, surrounding them like a living force. "You can't leave," the voices hissed. "You belong to us now." The group huddled together, paralyzed by fear. Suddenly, Olivia screamed and pointed toward the edge of the clearing. Shadowy figures emerged from the trees, their forms shifting and indistinct, as if they were made of smoke. The figures moved closer, their voices blending with the whispers. "Run!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Olivia's hand and pulling her toward the trail. The others followed, their panic overriding their confusion. They stumbled through the forest, the path barely visible in the moonlight. The whispers didn't fade. They followed, growing louder and more menacing. Branches clawed at their clothes and skin, as if the forest itself were trying to hold them back. One by one, they began to falter. Liam tripped over a root, and when Marcus turned to help him, both were engulfed by the shadows. Their screams echoed briefly before being swallowed by the whispers. "Keep going," Ethan yelled, dragging Olivia and Mia along. Ava, running ahead, suddenly stopped and turned. "It's no use," she said, her voice eerily calm. "They'll never let us go." Before anyone could respond, the shadows descended on her, pulling her into the darkness. Her scream was cut short, leaving only the whispers behind. By the time Ethan, Olivia, and Mia burst out of the forest and into the open field, the whispers had stopped. They collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. The night was still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. "Where are the others?" Mia sobbed, looking back at the tree line. There was no sign of Liam, Marcus, or Ava. "We have to go back," Olivia said, but Ethan grabbed her arm. "No, we're not going back in there." They made their way to the nearest ranger station at dawn, disheveled and terrified. The rangers organized a search party, but no trace of the missing campers was ever found. The clearing was empty, their tents and belongings gone as if they had never been there. To this day, the surviving three refuse to talk about what happened in Whispering Woods. But sometimes, late at night, they swear they can still hear the whispers calling their names. Story 2. The Lantern Man. James had always loved the wilderness. The solitude of the forest gave him a sense of peace he couldn't find in the bustle of city life. So, when he finally took a much-needed break from work, he packed his gear and headed for Black Hollow National Forest, a sprawling expanse of ancient trees and winding trails. The campsite he chose was deep in the woods, far from the marked paths, where the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. He set up camp near a small clearing by a stream, pitching his tent and gathering wood for a fire. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, James was comfortably settled in. He cooked a simple meal over the fire and watched the stars emerge in the darkening sky, feeling a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in months. The forest at night was alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, and the soft babble of the stream created a symphony that lulled James into a state of calm. But as the night wore on, he noticed a change. The usual forest noises seemed to fade, replaced by an unnatural stillness. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, as if the forest were holding its breath. James glanced around, suddenly uneasy. That was when he saw it, a faint light flickering through the trees. It was small and golden, bobbing gently as if carried by an invisible hand. A lantern, he murmured to himself. It was unusual for another camper to be this deep in the forest, especially at this hour. But the sight of the light gave him a strange sense of reassurance. Maybe he wasn't as alone as he thought. Grabbing his flashlight, James stepped away from his campfire and into the trees. The lantern flickered ahead, its warm glow beckoning him. "Hello?" he called, his voice sounding oddly muted in the still air. There was no response, but the lantern swayed as if someone had heard him and was walking away. Curiosity piqued, James followed. The light moved slowly, staying just out of reach. No matter how fast he walked, the lantern remained at the same distance, weaving through the dense forest like a firefly in the dark. He called out again, louder this time. "Hey, wait up!" The light didn't stop. The forest seemed to close in around him as he walked. The trees grew thicker, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. The only illumination came from the lantern, which flickered and danced ahead of him. James checked his watch and was startled to see that nearly an hour had passed. How far had he walked? The air was colder now, and the sounds of the forest had faded completely. It was just him and the light. A sense of unease began to creep over him. Something about the lantern felt wrong. It moved too smoothly, too deliberately, as if it wasn't being carried by a person, but by some unseen force. James stopped and shone his flashlight around the forest, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was holding it. There was nothing but trees and shadows. "This is stupid," he muttered, turning back the way he came. But when he shone his flashlight in that direction, he realized he had no idea where he was. The path he thought he had been following was gone, swallowed by the forest. Panic set in as he realized he might be lost. The lantern flickered again, brighter this time. Against his better judgment, James decided to follow it. At least it was a direction, and any direction was better than wandering aimlessly in the dark. As he walked, the forest seemed to shift around him. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their bark blackened and cracked. The air felt heavy, and a faint, acrid smell lingered. James's unease deepened. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that the lantern was just another camper who didn't hear him calling out. But then he noticed something else. The ground beneath his feet was undisturbed. No footprints. He turned back and shone his flashlight on the trail behind him. Nothing. The dirt and leaves were untouched, as if he hadn't walked there at all. "What the hell?" he whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. The lantern flickered again, almost as if in response, and he felt an inexplicable compulsion to keep moving. Hours passed, or at least it felt like they did. James's legs ached, and his head throbbed from the cold and exhaustion. The lantern never stopped, never slowed, always staying just out of reach. He wanted to stop, to turn back, but every time he considered it, the thought filled him with dread. It was as if the forest itself wouldn't let him leave. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the lantern came to a halt. It hovered in place, its glow steady. James approached cautiously, his heart pounding. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The lantern wasn't hanging from a hook or held by a hand. It floated in the air, suspended by nothing. "What is this?" he muttered, reaching out to touch it. As his fingers brushed the light, it winked out, plunging him into darkness. James stumbled back, disoriented. When his eyes adjusted to the dim light of dawn, he looked around and realized he was standing in a completely unfamiliar part of the forest. The trees here were ancient, their roots sprawling across the ground like veins. A dense mist clung to the air, muffling sound and obscuring his surroundings. Desperate, James pulled out his map and compass, but neither made any sense. The compass needle spun wildly, and the map didn't match the terrain. Panic set in as he realized he had no idea how to get back to his campsite. He wandered for hours, calling out for help, but the forest remained silent. His phone had no signal, and his supplies were back at the camp. By midday, he stumbled into a clearing and froze. There in the center was his campsite, or at least it looked like it. The tent was pitched, the firewood stacked neatly, and his gear was exactly where he had left it. But something was off. The colors were muted, and the air felt wrong, heavy with a sense of dread. James approached cautiously, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. As he reached the edge of the clearing, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There, on the ground, were his footprints leading into the forest, but they didn't lead back out. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He was miles from his campsite, yet here it was, untouched and waiting for him. And those footprints, they were the only ones. The forest had erased every trace of his journey, except the path leading away from the clearing. James backed away, his heart pounding, The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees leaning closer as if watching. He turned and ran, not knowing where he was going, just needing to get away. But no matter how far he ran, the whispers began, soft, almost imperceptible at first, growing louder with every step. By the time night fell, James was still running, the lantern's light flickering once more in the distance, waiting for him. Story 3. The Shapeshifter. The Davis family had been planning their camping trip for months. They'd chosen Clearwater National Park for its sprawling forests, crystalline lakes, and miles of hiking trails. For Emma and Chris, the parents, it was a chance to reconnect with their teenage children, Ellie and Jake, away from screens and distractions. For the kids, it was a chance to roll their eyes at their parents and, secretly, a chance to bond in ways they wouldn't admit aloud. The campsite was perfect. A secluded clearing near a bubbling stream, surrounded by towering pines. The first night passed uneventfully. They roasted marshmallows, told corny jokes, and marveled at the star-filled sky. But it was the second night when things began to shift. It started with Ellie. She had always been the quiet one, more interested in sketching in her notebook than in Jake's boisterous antics. But around the campfire that night, she seemed off. Her laughter came a beat too late. Her responses to questions were oddly phrased, and she kept tilting her head as if listening to something no one else could hear. "You okay, El?" Chris asked, tossing another log onto the fire. Ellie blinked, her eyes reflecting the flames. "I'm fine. Why? You just seem a little out of it," Emma said gently. Ellie smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Just tired. Long hike, you know." It was a plausible explanation. They'd spent the day trekking up and down trails, and everyone was worn out. The conversation moved on, and Ellie retreated into silence, staring into the fire with an intensity that made Jake nudge her shoulder. "Earth to Ellie," he teased. "Don't get lost in there." She didn't respond. By morning, Ellie was back to herself mostly. She joined in the family's breakfast preparations, made a snide comment about Jake's inability to start a fire, and even laughed when Emma tripped over a stray root. But there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when she seemed wrong. She moved differently, her steps unnaturally light, as if she wasn't touching the ground fully. Her eyes lingered too long on things. The knife on the picnic table, the flicker of a bird's wing in the trees, the sun breaking through the canopy. That afternoon, as they prepared for a hike, Ellie hesitated. "You guys go ahead," she said, pulling her sketchbook from her bag. "I want to stay here and draw for a bit." "Are you sure?" Emma asked. Ellie nodded. "I'll catch up later." Chris frowned, but didn't press the issue. "Stay close to camp, okay?" "Of course," Ellie replied, her voice light. The hike was enjoyable, but uneventful, though Emma couldn't shake a nagging worry about leaving Ellie behind. When they returned to camp, Ellie was sitting by the fire pit, sketchbook in hand. She looked up and smiled, but something about her expression made Emma's stomach twist. That night, Emma woke to a faint rustling outside the tent. thinking it might be an animal. She unzipped the flap cautiously and peered out. In the dim moonlight, she saw Ellie sitting by the fire pit, staring into the ashes. Her head tilted at an odd angle, and her hands rested in her lap, motionless. "Ellie," Emma whispered. Ellie's head snapped toward her, the motion too quick, too sharp. "Can't sleep," she said, her voice flat. Emma hesitated. "Do you want to come back to the tent?" Ellie shook her head slowly. "No, the fire's nice." The unease Emma felt that morning returned tenfold. She backed into the tent and zipped it up, her heart pounding. By the third day, everyone felt the tension. Jake tried to joke about it, calling Ellie a weirdo when she refused to eat breakfast. But even he seemed unnerved. Chris suggested they pack up and cut the trip short, but Ellie's reaction was unexpected. "No," she said sharply, her voice echoing through the clearing. She softened immediately, her tone almost pleading. We just got here. Let's stay a little longer." Emma and Chris exchanged a look. That night, Ellie didn't join them in the tent. She claimed she wanted to sleep under the stars, but when Jake peeked out to check on her, she wasn't there. The campfire was out, and her sleeping bag lay empty. Panic set in. The family spent hours searching, calling her name, their voices echoing through the silent forest. Just as dawn began to break, Ellie emerged from the trees, her clothes spotless, her hair unruffled. "Where were you?" Chris demanded. "Just exploring," she said, her tone unnervingly calm. "The forest is so beautiful at night." Emma's voice shook. "Ellie, you scared us. Don't ever do that again." Ellie tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I didn't mean to scare you." Her tone was almost mocking. That evening, Emma noticed something else. Ellie hadn't eaten all day. She'd pushed food around on her plate at breakfast, claimed to have eaten while wandering during lunch, and outright refused dinner. "You need to eat something," Emma said firmly, handing her a granola bar. Ellie took it, but instead of opening it, she simply held it, staring at Emma with an expression that sent a chill down her spine. By the fifth day, the change was undeniable. Ellie avoided sunlight. Her movements were unnaturally fluid, and her voice took on an odd, echoing quality. When Jake tried to joke with her, she stared at him blankly, her lips curling into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That night, Emma woke to find Ellie standing at the edge of the clearing, her back to the camp. The moonlight cast her shadow long and distorted. Emma approached cautiously, her heart hammering. "Ellie?" Ellie turned slowly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Go back to sleep, Mom," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. Emma froze. That wasn't Ellie's voice. It was close, but there was something off about it, a strange resonance, as if two voices were speaking at once. The next morning, Ellie was gone. The family searched desperately, their calls echoing through the forest. Hours turned into a day, and then another. When the park rangers finally found Ellie, she was sitting by the stream, her sketchbook in hand. She looked up at them and smiled, but Emma knew it wasn't her daughter. The thing that had taken Ellie wore her face, mimicked her voice, and moved with her grace. But it wasn't Ellie. The family packed up and left the park that day, leaving behind the campsite and the memories of a trip that had gone terribly wrong. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the thing pretending to be Ellie was watching them as they drove away, her smile lingering in the shadows of the trees. Story 4. Cave of Echoes. The thrill of exploration brought the group together. Alex, Mia, Jordan, and their leader, Casey, were avid spelunkers who had spent years traversing caves across the country. This trip, however, was different. They had ventured into the remote wilderness of Echo Ridge, a place shrouded in mystery and local folklore. Their campsite was nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by towering pines and the distant sound of rushing water. The journey to Echo Ridge had been arduous, but the promise of discovering uncharted caves was too tantalizing to resist. They set out early the next morning, their gear packed tightly and their spirits high. Casey led the way with her usual confidence, her headlamp cutting through the shadows of the forest floor. "We're close," Casey said, studying her map. The ridge should be just beyond this clearing. True to her word, they soon arrived at the base of a towering rock face. After some searching, they found it, a narrow crevice hidden behind a tangle of vines. It was barely wide enough to squeeze through, but the dark void beyond beckoned them. "This is it," Alex said, his voice tinged with excitement. An undiscovered cave. One by one, they slipped through the crevice and into the unknown. The cave was vast and beautiful, its walls glistening with mineral deposits that shimmered under the light of their headlamps. Stalactites hung like ancient chandeliers, and the air was cool and damp. "Hello," Mia called out, her voice echoing in the cavern. "Hello, hello, hello," the cave replied, the echoes unnaturally loud and clear. The group exchanged uneasy glances. "Weird acoustics," Jordan said, his tone dismissive. "Let's keep moving." They ventured deeper, marveling at the untouched beauty of the cave. But the echoes followed them, repeating every sound with uncanny precision. When Alex accidentally knocked over a loose rock, the echo of the crash reverberated endlessly, growing louder and more distorted with each repetition. "That's not normal," Mia said, her voice shaky. "Relax," Casey replied. "Caves do strange things with sound. It's probably just the shape of the chambers." But unease began to creep in. As they delved further, the echoes seemed to take on a life of their own. They weren't just repeating sounds, they were exaggerating them, twisting them into something unnatural. When they reached a large open chamber, Alex couldn't resist testing the phenomenon. "Let's see how loud it gets," he said, taking a deep breath and letting out a scream. The echo that followed was deafening. It was no longer just a reflection of Alex's voice. It was something more. It screamed back at them, a guttural, otherworldly wail that rattled the very walls of the cave. The group clapped their hands over their ears, their faces pale with shock. What the hell was that? Jordan shouted. No one had an answer. The chamber fell silent, save for the sound of their ragged breathing. We should leave, Mia said. No. Casey hesitated. She was reluctant to abandon the discovery, but the fear in her friend's eyes was undeniable. All right, she said. Let's head back. They retraced their steps, but the cave seemed different. The passages narrower, the air heavier, and the echoes weren't done with them. As they moved, they began to hear whispers, faint at first, but growing louder. The voices mimicked their own, calling their names with eerie precision. Alex, Mia, Jordan, Casey. Each name echoed through the darkness, overlapping and intertwining until it was impossible to tell where the sounds were coming from. Keep moving, Casey urged, her voice trembling. Don't stop. Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The group quickened their pace, but the cave seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The crevice they had entered through was nowhere in sight. We should have reached it by now, Mia said, her voice cracking. This isn't right, Alex muttered. It's like the cave is changing. The whispers turned to laughter, mocking and malicious. Shadows flickered on the walls, though there was no source of light. Casey stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. Wait, she said. Listen. The laughter ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, from the depths of the cave, came a low, rumbling voice. Why have you come? The question hung in the air, reverberating through the chamber. The group froze, terror rooting them in place. We didn't mean to disturb anything, Casey said, her voice barely above a whisper. The voice responded with a sound that could have been laughter or growling. You cannot leave. Panic overtook them. They ran, their headlamps bouncing wildly as they searched for the exit. The whispers and laughter chased them, growing louder and more distorted. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the walls closed in, forcing them in a single file. Finally, they saw it, the faint outline of the crevice. One by one, they squeezed through, emerging into the cool night air. They collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, their faces pale and their bodies trembling. But the echoes weren't finished. From the darkness of the cave came their names, called out in perfect imitation of their own voices. Alex, Mia, Jordan, Casey. The group stared at the crevice, their fear turning to horror as they realized the voices weren't fading. They were getting louder. We need to go, Casey said, her voice shaking. Now, they didn't stop running until they reached their campsite. But even there, in the supposed safety of the forest, they could hear the whispers. The cave had marked them, and the echoes would follow them wherever they went. For the rest of their lives, they would hear their names called in the dead of night, a chilling reminder of the cave of echoes and the terror that lay within. Story 5, Forgotten Trail. The group of 5 had heard the rumors for years. An ancient, forgotten trail hidden deep within the wilderness of Hollow Pine National Park. It wasn't marked on any map, and no ranger could confirm its existence. But the tales from local hikers spoke of an eerie path shrouded in moss and mystery, a trail that led to nowhere, or somewhere you didn't want to be. For Alex, Harper, Mason, Lily, and Ethan, the allure was irresistible. They were seasoned campers, each craving a new adventure. Equipped with top-notch gear and a shared sense of excitement, they set out on a sunny morning, determined to find the mythical forgotten trail. The first day was uneventful. They followed a well-trodden path, their laughter echoing through the forest. As the sun dipped low, they set up camp in a small clearing. Over the crackling fire, they shared stories, their chatter masking the subtle sounds of the forest around them. But Harper, ever the observant one, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It's just the excitement, she told herself, brushing off the unease. The next morning, they veered off the marked trail. Guided by whispers of old tales and vague directions found on online forums, they pushed deeper into the wilderness. The forest thickened and the light grew dimmer, even under the midday sun. Hours passed, and just when they began to doubt the trail's existence, they stumbled upon it. The path was barely visible, overrun with ferns and vines. But it was there, a winding, narrow strip of earth leading into the heart of the forest. The air grew heavier as they followed it, the chirping of birds and rustling of leaves fading into an oppressive silence. "This must be it," Mason said, his voice hushed as though afraid to disturb the quiet. "Let's set up camp," Alex suggested. "We can explore more tomorrow." They pitched their tents in a small clearing off the path. As dusk settled, they noticed something odd. Scattered among the underbrush were old, overgrown tents and rusted camping gear. A mug, still upright, was coated in moss. A backpack leaned against a tree, its straps frayed but intact. It was as if the owners had simply vanished. "Creepy," Lily murmured, her fingers brushing the rim of the moss-covered mug. "How long do you think this has been here?" "Years, by the looks of it," Ethan said. "But why didn't anyone take this stuff back? It's like they just left." Harper shivered, her earlier unease returning. "Maybe we shouldn't be here." "Come on," Alex said, forcing a grin. "It's just an old campsite. No big deal." The group tried to shake off the unsettling discovery, but as night fell, the forest seemed to come alive. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it faint sounds that could have been voices. Harper thought she heard her name once, faint and distant, but when she mentioned it, the others dismissed it as her imagination. That night, none of them slept well. Around midnight, they all woke to the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and circling their tents. Alex unzipped his tent and peered outside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was nothing there, no tracks, no animals, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. "It's probably a deer or something," Mason whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. The footsteps continued, stopping and starting at irregular intervals, always just out of sight. The group huddled together, flashlights scanning the trees, but they saw nothing. When the footsteps finally stopped, it was nearly dawn. Exhausted and on edge, they decided to pack up and leave. But the forest had other plans. The forgotten trail was gone. The path they had followed so clearly the day before had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees and underbrush. Panic set in as they searched for hours, their compasses spinning uselessly. The forest seemed endless, every direction leading them back to the clearing. "This doesn't make sense," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "We didn't walk that far off trail. It's like the forest is changing," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. As the sun dipped low once more, they were forced to set up camp again. The old, overgrown tents and belongings remained untouched, a haunting reminder of those who had been here before them. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, closer. Shadows flickered just beyond the firelight, shapes that didn't belong to the trees. The whispers grew louder, merging into a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Leave," one voice hissed, distinct and sharp above the others. "We're trying," Alex shouted into the darkness, his voice cracking with desperation. The forest answered with silence, oppressive and absolute. And then the fire went out. Panic erupted. Flashlights flickered as the group huddled together, their breath shallow and their hearts racing. The voices grew louder, more insistent, until they felt as though they were inside their very skulls. When dawn finally broke, the voices stopped. The forest was still once more, the forgotten trail nowhere to be found. Exhausted and terrified, the group decided to move in a single direction, hoping to stumble upon the main trail. Hours later, they emerged from the forest, disheveled and shaken but alive. The ranger station was a welcome sight, but their story was met with skepticism. "There's no trail like that in Hollow Pine," the ranger said, "and no record of anyone else going missing there either." But the group knew what they had seen, what they had experienced. They never spoke of it again, not even to each other. Yet on quiet nights, each of them could still hear it, the faint sound of footsteps circling just beyond the edge of the light. Story 6. Mark Tree. The trip had been Sarah and David's idea of escape, a weekend in the deep, untouched wilderness of Blackwood Forest. Far from their city jobs and constant notifications, the remote location promised solitude and serenity. They had driven for hours down winding roads and finally parked at the edge of the forest, carrying their supplies into a clearing surrounded by towering trees. By late afternoon, they'd set up their tent and started a small fire. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the subtle sounds of nature. Birds chirped in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at small animals nearby. It was exactly the kind of peace they'd been hoping for. As they ate their dinner by the fire, Sarah's gaze drifted to a tree just beyond the perimeter of their camp. Its bark was unlike the others, etched with strange, deliberate carvings. She nudged David. "Look at that," she said, pointing. David turned his head. "Huh, weird. Looks like symbols or something." Curiosity pulled them to their feet. Flashlights in hand, they approached the tree. The carvings were intricate, resembling a mix of geometric patterns and flowing lines. None of it looked random. Someone had spent time on this. "What do you think it means?" Sarah asked, tracing one of the symbols with her finger. The wood felt unnervingly smooth. "Probably some hiker trying to be artsy," David replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "Let's not overthink it. It's just a tree." Back at the fire, the unease lingered, though neither of them voiced it. They retired early, hoping a good night's sleep would ease their nerves. But sleep didn't come easily. Sarah woke several times to the sound of distant rustling. Each time she checked, the forest appeared still. When morning finally arrived, it brought a fresh sense of calm until they stepped outside the tent. The carvings on the tree had changed. What had been a handful of symbols the night before had multiplied, now covering the entire trunk. They were more intricate, almost pulsating with an unnatural precision. Worse, the markings now extended to other trees, forming a trail that stretched into the forest. "This wasn't here yesterday," Sarah whispered, her voice tight. David stared, his jaw clenched. "Someone's messing with us. Maybe other campers. We didn't see anyone else," Sarah replied, stepping closer to examine the nearest tree. The symbols were deeply carved, their edges sharp as though freshly made. Who could have done this overnight? David didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a stick and began scratching at one of the carvings, hoping to scrape it away. The bark resisted, as if the marks were part of the tree itself. "Let's pack up and go," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "I don't like this," but curiosity got the better of them. Against Sarah's protests, David suggested following the trail for a short distance, just to see where it led. He argued that it was better to know what they were dealing with than to leave in fear of the unknown. Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. They packed up their campsite but left the tent for later, intending to retrieve it after their investigation. The trail of marked trees led them deeper into the forest. With each step, the air grew heavier, the light dimmer, as if the forest were swallowing them whole. The symbols became more complex, more ominous. Occasionally, Sarah thought she heard whispers, faint and unintelligible, carried on the breeze. When she mentioned it, David dismissed it as nerves. After what felt like hours, the trail ended in a small clearing. At the center stood an enormous tree, its trunk thicker than any they'd seen before. The carvings covered it entirely, spiraling upward like a macabre masterpiece. At its base lay a small, flat stone, etched with the same symbols and stained dark, as if with age or something else. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. David stepped closer, examining the stone. "It's like some kind of altar," he said. "But for what?" As if in response, The whispers returned, louder now, unmistakable. They didn't come from the wind, but seemed to emanate from the marked tree itself. Words formed within the whispers, incomprehensible at first, but growing clearer. Leave. David stumbled back, his face pale. Did you hear that? Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We need to go. Now. As they turned to leave, the forest seemed to shift. The trail of marked trees was gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of dense underbrush. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. This isn't possible, David muttered, spinning in place. We just came this way. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The symbols on the trees began to glow faintly, casting an eerie light. Shadows flickered at the edge of their vision, darting between the trees. Sarah, David said, grabbing her arm. We have to run. They sprinted through the forest, their breaths ragged, branches clawing at their clothes. The whispers followed, rising to a deafening cacophony. No matter which direction they turned, the symbols seemed to guide them, funneling them back toward the clearing. When they finally stopped, exhausted and gasping for air, they were back at the marked tree. The stone at its base had changed. Where before it had been blank except for the symbols, now it bore an unmistakable image. Two human figures, etched in agonizing detail. One held a stick resembling the one David had used to scratch at the carvings earlier. It's us, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. David, it's us. The ground beneath them trembled. The symbols on the tree glowed brighter, their light casting long, twisting shadows. The whispers converged into a single, unearthly voice. You were warned. The last thing Sarah and David saw was the tree's bark splitting open, revealing something vast and dark within. The forest swallowed their screams, leaving only silence and the faint glow of the marked tree in the clearing. Days later, a ranger found their abandoned campsite. The tent was intact, the fire pit cold, but the forest's edge had grown thicker. The marked tree now standing among the first row of trees, its carvings waiting for the next visitors. Story 7. Silent Campground. The campground was everything they had hoped for. Lively, scenic, and nestled deep within the embrace of Whispering Pines National Forest. Sarah, Jake, Mia, and Eric arrived late Friday afternoon, excited to spend the weekend hiking, fishing, and swapping stories around the campfire. The air buzzed with laughter and chatter as dozens of campers set up their sites, the smell of grilled food mingling with the crisp pine scent. They chose a cozy spot near the lake, close enough to enjoy the view, but far enough to avoid the louder crowds. By sundown, their tent was pitched, and their fire roared as they toasted marshmallows under a canopy of stars. The campground's cheerful hum felt comforting, a sign of the shared joy among the scattered groups of campers. As the night deepened, the foursome turned in, the gentle murmur of distant conversations and the occasional crackle of a fire lulling them to sleep. When Sarah woke up, the silence was the first thing she noticed. No morning chatter, no sizzling bacon or shuffling footsteps from neighboring campsites. The only sound was the wind rustling the trees, a stark contrast to the previous evening's bustling energy. She nudged Jake awake. "Something's wrong. Listen." Jake sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What is it?" "It's too quiet," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where is everyone?" Mia and Eric stirred, groaning as they joined the conversation. "Maybe everyone's sleeping in," Eric suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. The four stepped out of the tent, blinking against the bright sunlight. Their campsite was untouched, but as they looked around, unease crept in. Every tent in sight stood abandoned. Plates of half-eaten food rested on picnic tables. Fires smoldered in their pits, and folding chairs sat askew, as if the occupants had left in a hurry. "This doesn't make sense," Jake muttered. He approached a nearby tent and unzipped it. Inside were sleeping bags, backpacks, and personal belongings, all undisturbed. Mia pointed toward the lake. "Even the boats are still here. Why would everyone leave without their stuff?" No one had an answer. The scene felt surreal, like walking into a snapshot of a life abruptly paused. "Let's pack up and get out of here," Sarah said, her voice tight with anxiety. "We can call the park rangers once we're somewhere with reception." As they began dismantling their campsite, a faint whisper reached their ears. It was so soft that at first they thought it was the wind, but as the minutes passed, the sound grew more distinct, weaving through the trees like an unseen thread. "Did you hear that?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Eric nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from the forest." They froze, straining to listen. The whispers were unintelligible, a low, murmuring chorus that seemed to come from every direction at once. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. "Let's go," Jake urged, his voice steady but urgent. "Now." They hurried to pack their gear, the tension thick in the air. As they loaded their bags, the whispers returned, louder this time. The sound was closer, circling their campsite like a predator stalking its prey. Mia clutched Sarah's arm. "We have to run." "But where?" Sarah replied, "We don't even know what this is." Before anyone could answer, a loud crack echoed through the forest, as if a tree had snapped in half. The group whipped around, scanning the woods for the source of the noise. Shadows flickered between the trees, quick and indistinct. "Go!" Jake shouted, grabbing their gear and leading the charge toward the trailhead. They ran, their breaths ragged, the forest closing in around them. The whispers followed, growing louder and more chaotic, blending into a cacophony of voices that seemed to mock their fear. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, pounded the earth behind them, though when they glanced back, nothing was there. "This way," Jake yelled, veering off the main trail onto a smaller path he'd noticed the day before. The others followed, their legs burning with exertion. The whispers began to shift, forming words now, though none they could understand. "We're almost there," Jake called, though he had no way of knowing if it was true. The dense trees made it impossible to tell how far they'd come or how much farther they had to go. Suddenly, the trail opened into a clearing. At its center stood a decrepit cabin, its wood weathered and dark. The whispers fell silent as they approached, replaced by an oppressive stillness. "What is this place?" Eric asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Does it matter?" Sarah snapped. "We need to keep moving." But as they turned to leave, the forest closed in. The path they'd taken had vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees. The whispers began anew, this time emanating from the cabin itself. "We don't have a choice," Jake said, his voice grim. "Inside." Now, they entered the cabin, the air inside heavy and stale. The single room was sparsely furnished, a table, a few chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold ash. On the walls were strange symbols, similar to the ones they'd seen in the forest. The door slammed shut behind them. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, the voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. Shadows began to move within the room, taking on vague, humanoid shapes. "What do you want?" Sarah screamed, her voice drowned out by the cacophony. The shadows converged, forming a single towering figure. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and when it spoke, its voice was a low rumble that shook the cabin. "You should not have stayed." The group huddled together, paralyzed by fear. The figure raised an arm, and the whispers reached a crescendo. Darkness enveloped them, a suffocating void that swallowed their screams. When the park rangers arrived the next day, the campground was empty. The tents, the fires, the food, everything was untouched. The only sign of the group was their abandoned car, parked at the edge of the forest. No one ever saw Sarah, Jake, Mia, or Eric again. Story 8. The Blackout. The night was perfect for stargazing. A meteor shower, one of the most anticipated celestial events of the year, lit up the night sky like nature's fireworks. The group of 6 friends, Emma, Tyler, Jess, Mike, Rachel, and Sam, had planned their camping trip by the lake weeks in advance. They'd picked the remote site to escape the city lights and bask in the natural brilliance of the heavens. Their campsite was cozy but lively. The crackling fire cast a warm glow, illuminating their faces as they laughed, told stories, and roasted marshmallows. The lake's still surface mirrored the starry sky, creating a surreal, infinite expanse of light. "This is incredible," Rachel whispered, her eyes fixed upward. "It's like the universe is putting on a show just for us. Totally worth the drive," Sam agreed, leaning back against a log. "I mean, how often do you get a view like this?" They all nodded in agreement, settling into a comfortable silence as the meteors streaked across the sky. Then, just as one particularly bright meteor burned its trail, everything went black. The fire, the stars, the faint glow from their flashlights and phones. All gone. "What the hell?" Tyler said, his voice breaking the stunned silence. "Where did the light go? Did the fire go out?" Jess asked, fumbling to reach for the pile of wood. Her hands found nothing but cold, damp earth. "It's not just the fire," Emma said, panic creeping into her voice. "Look at the lake. The reflection's gone too. It's like the stars disappeared." Sam clicked the button on his flashlight repeatedly. Nothing. He shook it as if that would coax it back to life, but the darkness remained absolute. "My phone's not working either," Rachel said, her voice shaking. "No screen, no light, nothing." "All right, everybody stay calm," Mike said, though his tone betrayed his own unease. "Let's stick together. We'll figure this out." Just then, they heard it, a faint splashing sound from the lake. It started softly, like ripples disturbing the water, but quickly grew louder and closer, as if something large was moving toward the shore. "Well, what is that?" Jess whispered, gripping Emma's arm. No one answered. They stood frozen, listening as the splashing ceased. The silence that followed was suffocating, but it lasted only a moment. Heavy breathing echoed across the campsite, raspy and uneven, accompanied by faint, guttural laughter. "Who's there?" Tyler shouted into the void. His voice sounded small and insignificant against the oppressive blackness. The laughter grew louder, a chilling, disjointed sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then came the sound of footsteps, wet, slapping against the muddy ground, approaching them. "Run," Emma whispered. "We need to run." "Where?" Rachel asked, her voice breaking. "We can't see anything." The group clung to each other, their breaths ragged and fast. The footsteps circled them now, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was out there was toying with them. Then, without warning, the laughter stopped. The silence was worse. "Maybe it's gone?" Mike ventured, his voice barely audible. A splash erupted from the lake, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large pulling itself onto the shore. The wet squelch of mud and the rasping breaths made it clear. Whatever it was coming for them. "We can't just stand here," Sam yelled. "We need to move." They stumbled blindly through the darkness, holding on to one another as they tried to find the path leading away from the lake. The ground beneath their feet was uneven, and more than once, someone tripped, only to be pulled back up by another. The breathing and laughter followed, relentless. Occasionally, they'd hear a loud splash, as if the creature returned to the water only to emerge again, closer each time. "I think we're going in circles," Rachel panted, her voice trembling with despair. "No, we're not," Tyler said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Just keep moving." Suddenly, Emma stopped. "Wait," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Do you hear that?" The others froze, their breaths hitching. The laughter had stopped. The breathing was gone. The only sound was their own pounding hearts. Maybe it's over?" Jess asked, her voice shaky. Then, from the direction they had come, a single word echoed through the darkness. "Stay." The voice was distorted, a low growl that sounded almost human, but not quite. It was enough to send them running again, fear driving them forward with no thought of direction. As they ran, the ground beneath their feet began to change. The soft earth turned to something hard and cold, like stone. The air grew heavy, thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. "Stop!" Sam yelled, pulling everyone to a halt. "We're not on the trail anymore." "Where are we?" No one answered. The darkness seemed to press in on them, almost tangible in its weight. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them gave way. They tumbled down a steep incline, landing in a heap at the bottom. "Is everyone okay?" Mike groaned, trying to sit up. "I think so," Rachel said, though her voice was shaky. "What just happened?" "I don't know," Emma replied, "but we need to keep moving." They scrambled to their feet, but before they could take another step, the laughter returned. This time, it was deafening, echoing all around them. Shapes began to materialize in the darkness, vague and shadowy, but undeniably there. "Run!" Tyler screamed, though none of them knew where to go. The shapes closed in, the laughter rising to a maddening crescendo. Just as it seemed they would be engulfed, a blinding light pierced the darkness. The friends collapsed, shielding their eyes as the world around them dissolved into brilliant white. When they woke, the sun was rising over the lake. The fire was out, but their campsite was untouched. Their phones and flashlights worked again, and the stars twinkled faintly as they faded into the morning sky. "Was that real?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. No one answered. They packed in silence, the memory of the night etched into their minds. As they drove away, none of them looked back at the lake. None of them ever returned. Story 9. The Shadow Watcher. It was a crisp autumn night at Blackwood Forest, the kind of night where the trees seemed to whisper with the wind, and the moon hung low, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The air was thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. As a group of 5 campers gathered around a crackling fire. They were in their early 20s, friends from university, escaping the grind of daily life for a weekend of hiking, stories, and laughter. The fire flickered brightly, throwing long, twisting shadows across the ground. "Man, it's so good to get away from the city," Ethan said, tossing another log onto the fire. His voice was filled with relief, his body leaning back into the warmth of the flames. "I agree," Emily said with a contented sigh, wrapping herself in a thick blanket. "The stars are so clear here. It's beautiful." "Yeah, nothing beats the peace of the woods," Jake chimed in, sitting next to Emily, his face illuminated by the glow of the fire. "No distractions, no work, just nature." They all nodded in agreement, the fire crackling and popping as the heat from the flames created a welcoming atmosphere. The night was serene, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the distance and the crackling of the fire breaking the silence. However, as the night grew deeper and the shadows around the campsite stretched longer, a sudden shift in the air seemed to occur. It was subtle at first, a small, barely noticeable feeling. Something was wrong. Lena, the quietest of the group, shifted uneasily in her seat. Her eyes kept darting to the edge of the light, just beyond where the fire's reach ended. Something about the darkness there seemed off. Did anyone else see that? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake, who had been poking at the fire, paused and glanced in the direction Lena was looking. He squinted, but saw nothing. See what? Lena looked at him, her eyes wide. There was something standing there, just at the edge of the light. The others stopped talking, their attention shifting toward the area Lena had pointed out. For a brief moment, there was nothing but the flickering fire and the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. I don't see anything, Ethan said, standing up and walking over to the edge of the firelight. He peered into the darkness, but only saw the shadows of trees swaying gently in the wind. You're probably just seeing things, Emily added, though she sounded uncertain. She too glanced toward the darkness, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Lena wasn't so sure. It was standing still, just watching. I swear I saw it. Maybe you're just tired, Jake suggested, trying to reassure her. We've been hiking all day. You're probably just seeing things. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She settled back in her seat, pulling the blanket tighter around her. They continued chatting, trying to shrug off the unease that had settled over them. The night passed without incident, and eventually, they all fell into a light sleep under the open sky. The next morning, the campers woke to the soft chirping of birds and the golden light of dawn filtering through the trees. They packed up their campsite, breaking down the tent and gathering their gear for a morning hike. But despite the fresh air and the beauty of the forest, Lena couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. You okay? Ethan asked, noticing her silence as they packed away their things. Lena gave him a forced smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just, I don't know. Something felt weird last night. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You sure it wasn't just your imagination? I don't think so, Lena murmured, her eyes scanning the area around them. The forest felt different in the light of day, less menacing, but the strange feeling lingered in her chest. Maybe we should stay here another night, Jake suggested, eager to extend the trip. We could do some night hiking, make it a real adventure. Lena shook her head. I think I'm ready to go home. The group finished packing, and they set out along the trail, though the odd tension from the night before seemed to follow them, like an invisible weight. They made their way through the forest, chatting about trivial things to pass the time. But even as the day wore on, Lena couldn't shake the nagging sense that they weren't truly alone. She had this feeling deep down that something or someone was still watching them. As evening approached, they decided to camp one more night, just as Jake had suggested. They found a small clearing near a stream and set up their tents, gathering firewood as the shadows of night began to lengthen once more. The fire crackled to life, and the group sat around it, trying to push the unease from their minds. But as the darkness grew, so too did the feeling that something was out there, something hidden just beyond the reach of the firelight. Lena was the first to notice it. A shape standing motionless at the edge of the light, just like the night before. It was taller than a man, its form undefined, a shadow among shadows. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was as if it was waiting. Lena's breath caught in her throat. "It's back," she whispered. The others followed her gaze, and for a moment, there was silence. They all stared at the spot where the figure stood, but the longer they looked, the more uncertain they became. The shadows played tricks on the eyes, and for all they knew, it could just be a trick of the light. But the stillness of the figure, its absence of movement, unsettled them. "I'm going to check it out," Ethan said, standing up. Before anyone could stop him, he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the edge of the firelight, his footsteps crunching against the leaves. As he approached the spot where the figure had been, the shadows seemed to deepen, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. But there was nothing there. Ethan sighed in relief, shaking his head. "You guys are freaking yourselves out. There's nothing here." He turned to walk back to the fire, but as he did, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. He glanced over his shoulder, and his heart stopped. The figure was closer now. It stood just outside the light, tall and unnaturally still, its features blurred like smoke. Ethan froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The others, too, saw it now, standing only yards away. There was no mistaking it. The figure was real. "It's coming closer," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Without warning, the figure began to move. Slowly, it advanced toward the group, its form shifting and swaying as though it was made of shadows themselves. Each step it took was silent, and with every step, it grew closer to the fire. Panic began to spread among the group. "What is it?" Jake shouted, his voice rising in fear. Lena grabbed Ethan's arm. "We need to leave now." But the figure didn't stop. It continued to move closer, and with each step, the firelight seemed to flicker, dimming slightly, as if the darkness around it was drawing energy from the flames. The air grew cold, and a strange pressure pressed in on them, as if the very forest itself had turned against them. "We can't stay here," Ethan said, his voice shaky. "Run!" In a frenzy, they grabbed their gear and sprinted into the woods, the sound of their footsteps mingling with the rushing of their hearts. Behind them, the figure seemed to follow, its form shifting through the trees, but never quite moving as quickly as they were. It was always just at the edge of their sight, too far to catch, but always nearer than before. Finally, they burst out of the trees, finding their way back to the main trail. They ran until their lungs burned, and when they finally stopped to catch their breath, they looked around. Nothing. The forest was quiet again, too quiet. The figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the light, stayed with them, lingering in the back of their minds. "Was that real?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Lena whispered, "but I think we should never come back here again." And as they made their way back to their car, no one spoke much. The forest behind them seemed to grow darker, as if it had a secret to keep, and the shadow watcher was still waiting somewhere in the deep woods, unseen but always near. Story 10. The Vanishing Camp. It was an early autumn morning when 5 hikers, Chris, Sophie, Matt, Olivia, and Ryan, set out for a weekend adventure in the wilds of Harrow Ridge. The ridge was a remote section of the mountain range, far from the usual tourist trails, offering a perfect combination of challenge and seclusion. The weather was crisp, the air fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the skies were clear, perfect for a long hike. As the group made their way through the dense forest, laughing and chatting to distract themselves from the weight of their backpacks, the day passed uneventfully. They had planned to make camp at a secluded spot near a stream, hoping for a peaceful night beneath the stars. But as the sun began to set, casting the forest in a soft orange glow, they stumbled upon something entirely unexpected. Tucked away in a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees, was an abandoned campsite. "Whoa," Matt said, pausing in his tracks. "What is this?" The others stopped, following Matt's gaze. There, in the middle of the clearing, was a tent, its fabric still intact and standing strong despite the weather. A small campfire pit sat nearby, its stone ring still encircling a layer of blackened wood. Scattered around the campsite were personal belongings: an open food container with partially eaten trail mix, a pile of clothes neatly folded beside the fire pit, a pair of boots left just outside the tent. "This is weird," Olivia muttered, her brow furrowing. "It looks like someone just left everything behind. Maybe they had to leave in a hurry," Sophie suggested. "I mean, look at all this stuff. It's not like they just abandoned it. But why would they leave everything? Food, clothes, even the tent?" Ryan asked, stepping closer to the pile of clothes. He picked up a thick jacket that had been abandoned carelessly beside the fire. "This is a good jacket. Why would anyone just leave it?" Chris walked over to the tent and knelt beside it, inspecting the flap. "I don't know, but it looks like it hasn't been touched in days. Maybe weeks. Could it be some sort of prank?" Olivia asked, glancing around uneasily. "I mean, who leaves a campsite like this?" "No way," Matt said. "This doesn't feel like a prank. Something's off about this place." After a moment of silence, Chris stood up and turned to the group. "Well, we're here now. I say we make use of it for the night. We were planning to camp anyway. No point in going back to the trailhead now." The others hesitated for a moment, still unnerved by the strange scene before them, but ultimately agreed. After all, they were miles from the nearest town, and the sun was rapidly setting. They set up their own camp just a few feet away from the abandoned one, each of them trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had settled over them. As the night wore on, the fire crackled, and the group sat around it, eating their dinner and chatting, trying to ignore the strange sense of discomfort. The shadows in the forest seemed to grow deeper, and every rustling noise in the underbrush made them glance nervously over their shoulders. But despite their unease, the night passed without incident. They huddled into their tents, one by one, and fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, the group awoke to a strange and eerie silence. The forest was still and calm, the sunlight filtering through the trees in a soft, golden haze. But as they emerged from their tents, a chilling realization struck them. Their campsite, everything they had set up the night before, was gone. The tent, the backpacks, the fire pit, all of it had vanished, as if they had never even been there. The clearing was empty, save for the remnants of the abandoned campsite they had discovered the evening before. The clothes, the food, and the boots were still there, exactly where they had been. But their own belongings, the things they had set up only hours ago, were nowhere to be found. This doesn't make sense, Sophie said, her voice trembling as she glanced around the clearing. Where are our tents? Where's our stuff? Chris felt his heart start to race. We were just here last night. We all saw it. Our camp. It was right here. What happened? Ryan walked in circles, his eyes scanning the area, desperately looking for some sign of their camp. This is insane. We're not imagining this, right? We definitely set up right here. Matt looked around, his voice tight. No, we didn't imagine it. I remember setting up my tent right next to the fire. But there's nothing here. Olivia shivered. It feels like we're in some kind of dream, or some kind of weird, alternate reality. Maybe we're sleepwalking, Ryan suggested, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. Maybe we never woke up last night, and we're still dreaming. Chris shook his head. No way. We're awake, and this is real. They all stood in silence, staring at the abandoned campsite, trying to make sense of the bizarre situation. After a few minutes, Chris took a deep breath. We need to get our bearings. Let's retrace our steps. Maybe we're just disoriented or something. Reluctantly, they began to walk around the clearing, looking for any sign of their missing equipment. But no matter where they searched, there was nothing. No trace of their camp. Just the abandoned site, with its eerily untouched items. We're not going crazy, Olivia said, her voice quiet but firm. We were here. I remember unpacking my stuff. This doesn't make sense. Sophie knelt beside the pile of clothes and food, her fingers trembling as she picked up an item that was unfamiliar to her. This is mine, but I didn't bring it with me. I don't even own anything like this. What do you mean? Ryan asked, walking over to her. Sophie held up a small, leather-bound notebook. I didn't bring a notebook. I don't even write in notebooks. Maybe it's just a mix-up, Matt suggested. Someone else could have left it here. But when Ryan picked up a small, dark scarf from the pile of clothes, he froze. This scarf, I swear I've never seen it before. It's not mine. It's not anyone's here. Something's wrong, Chris said, his voice becoming more frantic. These things don't belong to us. It's like someone else has been here, and we've just taken their place. Or maybe we never left, Olivia said, her face pale. Maybe we've always been here, and this is all part of some kind of loop. Maybe it's happened before. The group fell into a tense silence. the unsettling thought lingering in the air. Was it possible they had unknowingly stepped into someone else's life? That they were reliving a moment that had already happened? Or worse, that they were caught in some sort of twisted reality where their past had vanished? Okay, Ryan said after a long pause, his voice shaky. We need to get out of here. Something's wrong. This place, it feels wrong. Agreed, Chris said, his voice tight with panic. We'll head back to the trailhead and get the hell out of here. They quickly gathered whatever they could, even if they weren't sure if it was theirs or not. As they turned to leave, the forest around them seemed to close in, the trees pressing in closer together, as if guiding them toward a path they couldn't see. The eerie silence of the place settled into their bones, and they walked in tense, fearful silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. But as they made their way through the woods, the sun climbing higher in the sky, they noticed something strange. The trail was unfamiliar, the trees different from the ones they had seen on their way in. They were walking in circles, retracing the same path over and over again. The clearing, their camp, and the abandoned campsite were all gone. And then, just before the panic overtook them completely, they saw it. Up ahead, through the trees, another camp, exactly like the one they had found the night before. The same tent, the same food, the same clothes, and this time they knew they had never left.